Welcome to the Leaves of Change podcast, sponsored by Tree of Hope, a peer-run organization dedicated to serve the recovery community. Our hosts are Melissa Caffarelli, Madison Rubenthal, and Anta Say. They regularly bring you inspirational stories of hope and recovery.
Hey guys, it's Melissa here.
And Anta.
We're here with the Leaves of Change podcast. We're here to interview my friend Trish here, who is super awesome.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. So I gave you my book, and it's my story of my journey to recovery. I got clean and sober July 10th, 1995. My boys were 1.5 and 3. My husband had left. We both drank a lot together and did a lot of cocaine, smoked weed. It was an issue for me for over 20 years. I grew up in a foreign country. I grew up in Greece. My dad was CIA. My mother ended up leaving my father for another woman, so there were a lot of secrets in my house. And when we moved here and I was 14, I just really didn't feel like I fit in. I had a hard time getting along with people. My education had lapsed. I had gone to probably 12 or 14 schools by the time I was in middle school. And so started getting high and drinking and skipping school and hanging out with a really bad crowd. And my parents put me on an adult psych ward when I was 14 down at GW. And it just made me more angry. And so I started running away from home. And I was a runaway for about 2 years. I lived in the woods, in abandoned cars, abandoned houses, with gangs, and eventually became incarcerated for a year. Mostly in Baltimore, and the last place where I was closed because it was so inhumane. It was called Montrose, and I was not able to talk about a lot of those events for over 20 years, and that's why I wrote my story. And my book is called Blood on the Walls because the room where I was locked up at Montrose literally had blood on the walls. Really? Yeah.
Where was that?
Yeah. Where was it?
Yeah.
It was in Reisterstown, Maryland. So a lot of people from Baltimore City. Yeah. And it was originally started as a state school. And it would change throughout the years, but in the end, it was just a place where they would send the worst of the worst. And, you know, it was pretty horrendous. I mean, one of my best friends committed suicide. She slit her wrist, and she had been locked in her room completely naked, no sheets, nothing. And I had another friend who was raped by a guard for 3 days. We were snowed in, and she'd been raped.
Wow.
By a guard, yeah. So, it did eventually close because of the treatment of people, and, there were a lot of gangbangs. And, that was sort of the last step for me as far as, just really waking up to the fact that was not the life I wanted to live. But I continued to use for quite a few years. I went to college, and then when I got married, I dropped out of college, and my husband and I we like to party, but it was a really dysfunctional marriage. He left both times I was pregnant, and just felt like a really lonely time. And, like I said, when my boys were really little, he left. He was having a relationship, and I asked him to leave. And our house was in foreclosure. He was a gambler too. So, we weren't able to pay the mortgage. I was close to losing my job. I worked at a place with emotionally disturbed adolescents, and I loved my work, but obviously my drinking and my drug use was getting in the way of work. And, so I just kind of rebuilt from there, and it was really hard. I went to outpatient treatment at Suburban, and I struggled and felt really lonely, really depressed, and it took me a while to really get this program. I sort of used my boys as my program. I would focus on them and taking care of them and getting them to school, and I really had to dig deep and realize that I needed to stay clean and sober for me. I couldn't just do it for my boys. And, so I go to a lot of meetings. I have a sponsor. I do service work. And I have a higher power. I have women that I sponsor. And, my life is just amazing.
Can you take us through the first steps of when you decided to go to treatment? What made you did you wake up one day and just say, hey, today's the day, or?
No, that's actually a really good question. My ex and I it was getting pretty volatile between us. He would come and pick up my boys. He would have his girlfriend with him. I didn't know if he was going to bring them back. And he was pretty abusive emotionally. And so my mom and dad had us all meet, and, they tried to act like mediators. And during that conversation, during that meeting, my husband told my mom and dad about all the drug use that was going on, all the drinking, and my dad confronted me, and I lied. But
so it was like an intervention.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. And my mom threatened to take my boys away. So
that's the factor that made you want to switch it up. Yeah.
Right. And for me, the step work. I mean, if I don't realize that my life is unmanageable, I'm doomed. Step one, my life was completely out of control. I was powerless over all substances. Even to this day, I know that, if I even think I can have one drink or one puff of anything, I'm doomed. And I have to always keep that at the forefront of my brain and my thinking and my lapse into, whether it's halt, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, emotional distress, difficult relationships, struggling at work or whatever. I have to always look inward and realize that, there's using is not the answer.
So you keep yourself plugged in quite a lot, though.
I do.
Keep going to meetings and things like that.
I have to.
And you work in treatment, so that's pretty awesome.
So what made you want to work in treatment? What keeps you doing what you do?
So, like I said, I worked at a place called RICA, the Regional Institute for Children and Adolescents, and I did that for about 10 years. And I was injured. We did a lot of physical restraints and interventions, and I ended up getting hurt pretty badly. So I left that work and I went into special ed, and I loved the work, but I felt like this was a calling for me. As I gained more traction with my sobriety, I just felt like this was a natural.
Wait, so you taught special ed first? You were a teacher?
For 7 years.
Oh, wow. That's what I was in school to be a teacher, too.
Yeah,
but then
I loved it.
To switch into counseling. Interesting.
Yeah.
So if anybody wanted to get a hold of your book, how do you do this?
So it's on Amazon. I would love for anybody and everybody to check my book out. I self-published it, and it's called Blood on the Walls, Trisha Earnest, and
I really want to check it out.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No
thank you. I really appreciate the support.
So everybody go out there and get that.
Yeah, thank you.
Blood on the Walls, Trisha Earnest, right here.
Do you have any advice for anybody who's new and coming into treatment? If they're nervous and they don't know about going to meetings or anything, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, so I always encourage people to give it at least a year. I mean, life does not get better right away. I know for any of us who have experienced recovery or even relapse, just give it time. In my program of AA, we talk about the promises that come true for us, that life does get better, and we find that we can handle things we couldn't handle before, and we learn to be a worker among workers, and we learn to stop pointing the finger at everybody else and realize that it's constant work for us to do. Nobody's going to do it for us, and to just give it time. Life gets different at first. It gets uncomfortable, but it gets far better than I ever could have imagined.
Right.
I never could have conceived the life that I have now.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Thanks.
Do we have any more questions? I don't know.
I think that's it.
I think that was perfect.
Thank you.
Honestly,
Thanks
for your
so much,
story.
Trish.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Well, that's another episode of Leaves with Change podcast. I'm Anta, Melissa, and check out our book.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Leaves of Change. Stay tuned for more inspirational stories of recovery. For more information about Tree of Hope and more podcasts, check out www.treeofhopeassn.com. Also, like us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter by searching Tree of Hope Association.